And finally, here goes the second part of my solution. And we left off after creating the John object, including this huge calc tips method. Okay, now for Mark, this is all going to be very similar. And so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this entire object and then do some changes to it. So the name, of course, is not John, but Mark. And it's Mark Miller. Then this is $77, $475, okay, then 110, and finally 45. So he only went to 4 restaurants. Then down here in the calc tips, all that we have to change is like these tipping rules. Okay, so let's see how Mark does it. So he likes to tip 20% when the bill is less than $100, 10% if it's between 100 and 300, and 25 if it's more than 300. So let's translate that into our code. So here it's 100. So less than 100, it's 20%, or actually less than 100. Okay, then if it's between 100 and 300, he gives 10% as a tip. And if it's even greater than 300, then he gives 25. So probably because he's at a very fancy restaurant and then he needs to give more tips, something like that. Okay, so that is the Mark object, and it's already done. So let's do the calculation here for Mark as well, and then log both John and Mark to the console. So let's check it out. And indeed, here we have our tips and our final values. All right. So this worked already. We now have the tipping completely implemented for both Mark and John. So let's take a look at what the next step is. And it is to create a function to calculate the average of a given array of tips. And then, of course, calculate the average for each family using that calculator, so that finally we can log to the console which of the families paid on average the highest tips. All right, so let's create that function. And I'm going to do it here after this object. So function calc average. And it's going to receive a tips array. Okay, so now I'm going to do what I told you as a hint. So I'm going to start with a variable called sum, which will start at 0. Okay, so in the beginning, of course, our sum is 0. And now what we have to do is to loop over the tips, and then in each iteration add the current element to the sum. So let's implement that. So for, and once more we start with a variable called I at 0, with I less than the tips.length, and then we increment I. So this is pretty standard. You're seeing at this point that it's basically always the same here, right? And so now what we do is that we say that the sum should be equal to the current sum plus the tips at the current position. Okay, makes sense? So let's say that we pass in an array of 2, 6, and 4. All right, so in the beginning, our sum will be 0. And then we will enter the loop. And so at this point, we have that the sum is 0 plus the current element, which is 2. And so 0 plus 2 will be 2. And so the new sum will be 2. So let's just write it down here. So we start up, of course, with 0. After that, we have 2. And so in the next iteration, we have 2 here as a sum. And then the current element of the loop is 6. So this one here, right? So 6 plus 2 is then 8. Okay, and so 8 is assigned to that sum variables. Okay, then in the next iteration, sum will be 8, and 8 plus the current element of the array, which is 4, will then finally be 12. Okay, and so that's it. So we went through the entire array and added all of these elements together, and in the end, we ended up with 12, which of course is the result of adding all of these 3 together. Okay, so that's just an example, just to demonstrate how this function works. Okay, and so in the end, all we have to do is to return the sum divided by the elements that are in the array. So tips.length. Okay, so for example, in the array that we had before, it had 3 elements, and so tips.length would be 3. And so the average would then be 12 divided by 3, which would be 4. Okay, so that's how you calculate averages. So we have now our objects, we have our calc average function, and so now let's do all the calculations. So we already calculated the tips here, then we log them to the console just to make sure that they are correct. Then we can also calculate the average. And what I'm going to do here is to actually calculate the average and then store them inside of each of the objects. Okay, so I'm going to say John.average is calc average using John.tips. Okay, and why John.tips? Well, that's because this is the array in which all of the tips are stored, right? So that is the array that we defined here. So this dot tips, okay? And so we pass that into the calc average function, which will then return the average, and we will store that into the average property on the John object. Now you may ask, well, why didn't we add this calc average here as a method to each of the objects? Well, we didn't do that because that would be duplicate code. So we would have to have the exact same code on both of these objects. And so we would basically repeat ourselves with the exact same code. And that's not good. Okay, so it's best to just leave it outside here as this function, then calculate it outside, and then only then basically add it to each of the objects. So we do it with John, and then we're also going to do it with Mark. All right, and so let's actually do this console log here after that, so that we also can see the newly added averages. All right, so let's try that now. And where is it? Yeah, here we go. So here's the average of the 3, or actually of the 4 paid tips. So we have these values here, and the average of them is 18. And in case of Mark, these are the 4 tips, and the average of that is 38, which is significantly higher, simply because of this huge tip here with $118. All right. So these are the calculations for the averages, and now all we have to do is to really do the console.log. So if John.average is larger than Mark.average, then we can say console.log, of course. So John.fullname. Now the escape, in order to escape the quotation here. So John's family pays higher tips with an average of, and now the average tip. Okay, and if it's the other way around, let's just copy it. It's Mark here, so Mark.average is greater than John.average. Well, then it's of course the other way around. So Mark and Mark here as well. All right, so that should be our final result. And indeed, Mark Miller's family pays higher tips with an average of $38. Okay, just to test this, let's decrease this one here from 110, or actually this one here. Let's decrease it from 475 to like $5. And so the average should then decrease. And so yeah, so now John Smith family pays the higher tips with an average of 18. All right, so that is the solution to this quite bigger and maybe a bit more difficult and confusing challenge. But I hope that you liked it and that you were able to at least do part of it. So I understand if you didn't do it all, okay? And so that's, again, no problem. You shouldn't feel bad about that. The most important part is that you try it here and that you put in the time to try to solve the challenge. So that's really all that matters at this point. And I'm serious here, okay? So that's really what matters most. Anyway, you're now done with the first JavaScript introduction. So congratulations on that for making it this far in the course. That's already a huge achievement. Now, some JavaScript courses stop at this point and consider that you know enough to write JavaScript on your own. But of course, that's very far from the truth. Now, don't get me wrong, you have already learned a lot by now, okay? But we are really just getting started with a lot of great content coming up over all of the next sections. And there's actually even one more video coming up in this section, which is just about the JavaScript versions. So make sure not to miss that one, because it's also important to know that kind of stuff. It's not about coding, but it's still important, okay? So I hope that you take a look at that right now.